Okay, setting up a general development program. So general development programs are exercise programs where we're primarily interested in development of most athletic qualities, or at least all the main ones that most people would be interested in. So of a general development program that we want to emphasize with training that we consider to be like general population. So general population is like, hey, like this is like 80 to 90% of the population, and most people generally have the same goals. Those goals generally include things like weight loss, which we discussed in another video. Is primarily going to be controlled by your nutrition. It's not going to have a whole lot to do with your training, aside from maybe in special cases you're going to add more cardiovascular training into your programming. But so now what does that mean in terms of developing a program? Well, developing a program, and there's a lot of different approaches to general development training, and probably the one most people are most familiar with is going to be CrossFit training. That's generally, in its older incarnation, and which they've gotten better about in recent times, depending on the coach at the gym. But they generally just take everything that most people want to do and they just kind of slap it all together and make a circuit out of it, and they say go forth. Another approach to that is basically you just block out, you take the total amount of time during your session or during all your weekly training, and they block it out, and instead of just mixing everything together, everything has these 9 discrete blocks. Which generally for most people is going to be a better approach unless you're severely constrained by training time. Like if you can only work out 1 or 2 days a week, like CrossFit might be a better option for you if you're trying to develop a broad range of motor abilities. But just keep in mind that, with any form of training, obviously if you're only going to work out a couple times a week, you're not going to see as much progress in anything compared to if you train 7 times a week, and that's just a fact of the matter. So that being said, when we look at kind of like blocking training out, generally we're always going to want to have a hypertrophy component, strength component, and sometimes those can be the same depending on how important strength is to the individual. So if we're a lot of times, we can go kind of like the power building approach, which is where we lift relatively heavy weights for our compound movements, or at least like the big 3, and then we kind of follow more of a hypertrophy training protocol for the rest of the exercises in the program. Or we can just kind of like shoot down the middle. So instead of having we train at 80+% 1 rep max for our strength exercises, and then we shift down to 60% for our hypertrophy exercises. Sometimes we can just shift down we can just shoot down the middle at 70 to 80% for all the compound movements, and we drop things down for the isolation stuff a little bit. So that's an approach there. That'll typically satisfy kind of like the strength and hypertrophy aspects of the program. For mobility, and mobility is one of those things that, in order to increase mobility, the best way to do that is you want to increase your ability to express force at these more extended joint ranges. So it's not often enough, while a lot of people may think on its face that, the way to develop mobility is to stretch all the time, and that's certainly a component to it in developing extreme ranges of mobility. Most people kind of, what's usually more beneficial for most people is trying to get stronger at these more extended joint ranges. So instead of just, doing hamstring stretches all the time, it may make more sense to do RDLs and implement, do some kind of RDL or straight leg deadlift, or even the 45-degree back extension, and incorporating, a set or two where you're holding an isometric stretch for a couple of minutes, during one of the, at some point in the session, And when we look at increasing mobility, this is kind of where we start falling into my way of doing it, where, I like to train the compound movements very much in a strength and, power production fashion. And then I take all the isolation work, and something that kind of goes pretty well together is making your isolation exercises also your mobility exercises. But often what this does, this requires us to get out of the sagittal plane for a lot of accessory movements, which is fine, because especially when we look at like the ball and socket type joints, like the hip and the shoulder, a lot of the muscles that function at those joints tend to function best outside of the sagittal plane. So if we're trying to increase shoulder mobility, a lot of times this kind of gets into where we're using, we're doing like shoulder raises that involve some form of rotation, and we're doing shoulder raises back behind the body. We're doing rear delt raises where we're allowing the arm to reach across the body. We're really trying to explore some of these other ranges of motion, and and also we want to get strong within those ranges of motion. So that's a strategy you can utilize to help, satisfy kind of like the hypertrophy checkbox, and also, increase joint mobility. And if they want to increase mobility above and beyond that, which would be developed through some of these more, targeted isolation exercises, then you can get into more stretching protocols, and things like isometric training can take a larger emphasis in your programming if mobility is that important to somebody. But for most people, they generally don't need to develop mobility above and beyond that required to do a lot of those types of movements. The next aspect too is getting people into some form of speed training. And this is one of those things that you have to expose. You have to expose the body to higher forces in training. If you want to be able to tolerate the forces associated with things like sprinting and throwing and stuff like that, you actually have to do those activities. But that doesn't mean that you sprint every couple of weeks and you go all out every time. You have to take a little bit more of a structured approach, especially if you're trying to balance it out with the other components of your program, where you're going to drop the intensity a little bit, you're going to aim for a little bit more volume, you're focusing on increasing the capacity of your tissue to tolerate the training, and then, over a period of several months while you do that type of stuff, because you're not training to be the world's fastest sprinter, you're just trying to get to a place where you can sprint reasonably fast, and you're not worried about hurting yourself. It's not going to hurt your knee every time you do it, and that's kind of one of those things where, and same thing with throwing, same thing where we see this a lot of shoulder training. People that they want to be able to throw a ball or something without pain. It doesn't mean you need to sit there and throw a baseball 100 times at lower intensities. But what it does require is that you do have to expose your body to similar ranges of motion that you would see with something like a baseball throw. So you want to get used to expressing force. You might want to include some exercises where you are kind of in this externally rotated position and you have to internally rotate something. So a lot of people that don't tolerate throwing very well, a lot of times they just lack a lot of rotational strength of the shoulder, because it's never trained. Even in cases where they do a lot of isolation work and, the pectoral muscles, the delt muscles are fairly strong, but they don't have very good external and internal rotational ability. So when they do something like try to throw a ball really hard that requires a lot of rotational strength, a lot of times those people can be at risk of having shoulder pain. And then lastly, and not to say that it's the least important thing, but obviously you need to have cardiovascular training in there. And this is a lot of those things too, where you got to kind of balance out cardiovascular training with all the other components of your program. So for people that aren't training very much, they're only training a couple days a week, this is kind of where it's hard to fit a lot of these things in, and this is kind of one of those cases where you may have to limit your goals on some level. And given the importance of cardiovascular training, especially in today's society, it's one of those things where if someone's only training once or twice a week, you may have to split your session in half and and you have to make compromises, because if you try to pursue these programs where you're trying to have this huge variety of exercises and you're trying to check every single box in the training toolbox, that you can to get them all their goals, but they're just not able to put the time into training, you're going to minimize the progress towards those things that are probably going to be most important. So in those cases, a lot of times you may have to just say if you're only training 2 days a week, you do a full body lift session, you get them through as much of it as possible. That full body lift session could very well just be something where, you have them rotate between shoulder presses, pull downs, and split squats. And obviously they're not going to burn through it super fast because, the cardiovascular demand of rotating through those three exercises is going to be decently high. So, but, it's one of those cases where you do what you can, and then you burn through those three exercises for 30 minutes and then, you spend the next 30 minutes doing some kind of cardio modality. And that's one of those things would a program like that, and that would be an extremely simple program, and it's one of those is it going to get them to all their goals super fast? No, absolutely not. But they're going to at least see some progress towards all their goals. And then obviously as their fitness level improves, and especially as their training time improves, and you can start expanding out into other exercises, once they've built up a base with at least a couple of movements. Now, granted, if they are training 2 days a week, and could you do one session where it's more hypertrophy and mobility focused, and then you have another one that's more, strength and speed focused, sure. But a lot of times you see people only training 2 days a week, and weight loss and cardio is a huge component. A lot of times, they're just not able to tolerate speed training very well initially anyways. That's one of those things you can kind of put a check mark in that one to kind of get after it later once they develop just general work capacity overall. Because generally speaking, for most people, developing some base level of general metabolic capacity and some general hypertrophy, general strength training, general endurance is going to help prepare them for more speed and more intense forms of training later on. Now, granted, for people that can train every day and you're trying to pursue, say a general development program, you might have, then you're typically looking at some kind of body part split. So you might do like an upper, there's a lot of ways you can organize it. You just got to find a system that works and something that works with your schedule, works with the gym equipment that you have available, and that's the primary thing that's going to determine what sort of split that you run. So you might do like upper lower strength day and then upper lower speed day, for example, later on in the week, and then you're probably going to do a cardio or something like that, maybe after your lower body strength workouts, or you do it like the next day or something. Other options might just be like where you rotate through movements. Every upper body day, for example, you do strength, hypertrophy, and speed. You always want to have some form of force training, some form of higher velocity training, some form of endurance and cardiovascular training, and then if you need more mobility or if you want to develop more mobility, a lot of times, then you'll have those exercises dedicated towards mobility. And that's kind of an easy one too, especially if mobility is not, you don't need to develop extreme amounts of mobility. It's pretty easy to just make your isolation exercises a little bit more mobility focused, as opposed to making all of them compound movements, for example. Those are kind of like the essential characteristics of any sort of general development program. And then really how you organize those is always going to be determined mainly by the amount of time you have to train, the equipment that's available to you, and honestly like what you like doing. So, and if cardiovascular training is something that's going to be more important to you, it can still be a general development program, but you might do like 3 cardiovascular training sessions a week instead of 2, for example. You don't have to do it's not something where you have to say, oh, well, I want to focus a little bit more on cardiovascular training now as opposed to strength training, and then you just quit strength training for a month and you only do cardio. And then when you've lost half your strength gains, then you quit doing cardio, and then you focus entirely on strength and hypertrophy. Some element of those needs to always be present in your program. You just might slightly emphasize more, one or the other, during different phases, depending on what you happen to care most about at the time.